Thanks for again joining us today for a masterclass on behavioral science, a very interesting topic to all of us. This is a session that is organized by the UNDP Global Center Singapore to our colleagues who were part of our multi-city Africa Challenge initiative. But some of you today are coming from the UNDP country offices. Some of you are coming from the accelerated labs, where you are addressing some of the urban challenges on the ground. So we thought this expert presentation by Ideas42 and two of our speakers on the role of human behavior in the success of solutions to address some of the urban challenges, it would be very valuable for all of us, at the UNDP. So that's why we, in addition to our city colleagues, we have decided to invite some of our colleagues within the UNDP network. So before we go into the session itself, I just wanted to give some information about the Multi-City Challenge itself, those of you who were not part of the initiative. So Multi-City Challenge Africa was an innovation challenge tackling urban issues the cities are facing in 5 different African cities. So those were the Accra, Behaviour, Kampala and Kano, and also Mutare. So the residents of these 5 cities in Africa were encouraged to submit their best ideas to solve one of the 3 challenge areas. So those challenge areas were, one of them was integrating the informal economy, and second one was to build urban resilience, and the last one was around improving waste management. Last month we had our winners ceremony. So we had 12 winners in total, 3 winners in each of the challenge categories. So it has been a great conclusion to the challenge itself. So this innovation was co-organized by GovLab at the New York University. So that has been running since 2020, and we concluded that last month. We wanted to, the UNDP Global Center in Singapore wanted to work towards supporting some of the teams in making these solutions a reality and support them in terms of implementation. So with this in mind, we have been running this masterclasses exclusively to those colleagues who were part of the challenge. So I hope that gives you some overview of Multi-City Challenge itself. If you would like to have more information, please visit the website that is written on the slide. Okay, so let's, without any further ado, I would like to invite our speakers from Ideas42. Unfortunately, Laura couldn't join us today due to a health-related issue, but we have Cecilia Shang to give us her expert presentation on behavioral science. Cecilia is going to be joined by Abigail Selman, Abby, who's going to help us facilitate some of our discussion. Cecilia Shang is a senior associate at Ideas42 Behavioral Science Lab. Her work at Ideas42 includes issues related to improving effectiveness of governance and public administration. So this will be an interactive session. Please unmute yourselves if you'd like to, or use the chat box to ask any questions you have throughout the presentation. And you will have some opportunity to discuss some of the concepts you learned in this masterclass in the breakout rooms that we're going to organize later in the session. So please, Cecilia, thanks again for joining us. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Erna. Let me share my screen. Great. So thank you for the introduction. And it's great to hear that we have a diverse range of participants today. And so whether you've never heard of behavioral science before or you've read a little bit about it, hopefully the ideas and insights we'll share today can be helpful for you to understand a bit about behavioral science and have a taster of how it can be applied. So my colleague Abigail will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, we definitely want this to be relevant and helpful to your work and the urban challenges you're working on. So definitely feel free to ask any questions, and Abby can help answer them as we go. So first of all, just to provide a little bit of context about who we are, at Ideas42, we are a nonprofit behavioral design lab. So we're researchers, consultants, and innovators, and we use insights from behavioral science, which I'll explain a little bit more about in the coming slides, to design solutions to solve sticky social problems and complement kind of more traditional solutions. We have an ambitious goal to take insights from behavioral economics and from academic theories and literature and experiments and use them to create evidence-based solutions that can help millions of people worldwide successfully follow through on their best intentions. And we've worked in more than 40 countries around the world in a large range of different focus areas, from education to health to international development. And Abigail and I and some other colleagues work also on international governance. And we also partner closely with a range of many different kinds of groups, including governments, foundations, NGOs, and private sector entities. So that's a little bit about us, but I think we're going to spend the most of the time today providing an introduction to applied behavioral science. And today is actually my birthday, and I am truly excited to just start my day talking about a topic I find personally very fascinating, and I hope you all do as well. So firstly, behavioral science is a very interdisciplinary field, and it draws from many social sciences, including psychology, economics, sociology, human-centered design. And we use our understanding of decision-making and how human beings make decisions and act to design solutions for social impact. So to start with a very mundane and somewhat silly seeming example of how our behaviors don't always match our intentions, here is an image of a gym in America. And I don't know, maybe this is a very American image, but the people in this photo presumably go to the gym to exercise. And then instead of walking up the stairs, they take the escalator. So why would they do this? This seems potentially kind of at conflict. And this is where the study of human behavior and decision making, what we broadly call behavioral science, can give us a different lens through which to look at situations. So we know that our environment or context can play an enormous role in shaping our actions, and this influence is often bigger than other things we typically think drive our behavior, like personality or values or deliberation. So we're going to talk about theory just very quickly. So this is a standard traditional economic behavioral model. It's fairly linear, rational, and we assume that people make a cost-benefit analysis. And if the benefits are greater than the costs, they'll decide to take the action and achieve the outcome that they desire. So if this model was representative of all behavior, you would then be able to infer what people decided based on the outcome. But we know in reality, this is not always the case. So when we adopt a behavioral model, we know that in reality, sometimes people don't always make decisions in the first place, or their decisions may not clearly lead to actions. There might be many different factors that get in the way, such as looking at what everyone else is doing, potentially whether they're in the mood, how long it will take, or just procrastinating and doing it another day. And while this diagram may initially seem chaotic and random, behavioral science can actually help us tease out and predict how these different influences impact our behavior and help us understand how people might react in different situations. So at this point, Erna, can you help us put the poll up? We have a few questions just to think about our own decision making.
Thanks for responding really fast. 16, 17, 18, 21 people have already answered to the poll questions. Great, 40 people out of 55 of us have voted. So please go ahead and answer 3 of the questions that we posed.
Well, it seems like we're getting there. Maybe the last ones are trickling in.
Yep.
Maybe I'll give it a few more seconds.
Sure.
But 78, oh. Awesome. Okay, 83% seems pretty good.
Yeah.
So I think everyone should be able to see the results on their screen. So this poll was to just show that if we look at the first one, we see that the majority of respondents, including myself, so 76% of people did not exercise as much as they wanted to. So that kind of shows what we were talking about. Perhaps despite having an intention to exercise, we have difficulty following through and actually taking the action. And when we look at the second question, seems like a majority of people also think that they will exercise more next week. So 59% say, yes, I will exercise more next week. However, in the third question, we see that the majority of participants did not make plans to exercise more next week. And what we know from behavioral science is that this means that the gap between how much you want to exercise and how much you actually exercise will probably keep persisting. And this isn't because, of course, we don't want to exercise or we're lazy or it's not some problem with ourselves, but it's a product of human nature largely. Thank you. I'm going to close the poll and keep moving. Thanks everyone for filling that out. So that previous poll illustrated kind of the area that where we typically work. So the assumption about human behavior typically is that when someone has an intention to do something, they take that action. But clearly that doesn't always happen. And we call this an intention action gap. And our work often tries to solve these gaps to help bridge it and help people follow through on their intentions. And besides just exercising, this idea shows up in more consequential decisions, such as in the design of policies, programs, or even infrastructure choices. So here's an example where a bridge was constructed to help people safely cross over a busy, traffic-filled street, with the assumption that those who want to cross will do the rational thing and walk over the bridge. However, in reality, we see that people may behave in a way that maybe from a policymaker perspective or from the perspective of the ones who built the bridge, it seems irrational or risky or confusing. However, taking a behavioral perspective, we can factor in kind of what else is going on in the context, what might be habitual, what might be easy, what everyone else is doing. And this can help us better understand what is going on and why we aren't having the desired outcomes. So to recap, in the traditional assumption, you might build an intervention or a solution, and then incentivize it and teach it and assume that then people will follow and do the action. However, this is not always how people behave, and there might be a gap there. And to understand this gap, we need to understand how our human decision-making interacts with the context. So behavioral science explores how the context of the world around us interacts with the different quirks and kind of well-studied and predictable psychological aspects of our brain and cognition, and how that together results in the behavior we exhibit. And what we've learned is that these patterns of behavior are not random and chaotic like that initial theoretical model, but they can actually be quite predictable depending on the context of an individual is in. So what exactly do we mean by context? In the previous examples, we discussed how the contextual features can be your physical environment, whether that's the bridge or the 24-hour fitness example. And even just looking around your Zoom home office, you may notice features that influence your behavior. For me, I know how close I am to the fridge is a huge contextual feature of my physical environment that influences my behavior. However, when we talk about context, there are additional factors that can be relevant and which have been shown to significantly impact our decision-making and behavior. And today, we'll talk through 3 of these factors. Firstly, the context can refer to the social or cultural context in which we're living. And we are, as human beings, very social creatures. So the predominant behaviors and norms around us influence us greatly. We tend to reflect and respond to social norms or what others are doing, and also respond to signals about what's expected of us and the implicit, unstated rules. And you can see the influence of social context in everyday life. So if you see a group of people looking up, you're probably going to look up too. You're probably more likely to jaywalk when others around you are jaywalking, perhaps even if you might not do so on your own. And people are often guided more so by the perceived group rules or standards and what they see everyone else doing, even more so than maybe what is explicitly stated. And we're influenced by the behavior of those around us and by this social context, whether we realize it or not. And the influences can be very visible on the one hand, like these examples, or they can be hard to see, like social norms about saving money or voting. And so another kind of cute clip that we use often to illustrate this concept is from Candid Camera. It's a video from the 60s. But I'll play it for a minute just to kind of drive this concept home.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again.
Great. So I think that clip is just a very real physical example of how other people's behaviors might seem odd, and yet we copy it anyways. And so sometimes the answer of whether to do something doesn't come from within, but actually comes from what we're seeing others do. And social norms are really interesting because they can motivate both good or bad behavior. In one experiment, researchers placed advertisement flyers on windshields in a parking lot. And in one condition, there was already litter on the ground. And in another, the ground was clean. So when the subject returned to their car, they had the option to either take that flyer and litter themselves or toss it out properly. And these graphs just show that in either case, the norms of the parking lot, so the subject was much more likely to litter when the ground was already littered, so when they saw that that was the norm, than when the ground was clean. And they also saw that when they had an actor litter versus not litter, in the dirty ground example, when the ground was already littered, when the actor littered, they were even more likely. So when they had that added norm of seeing someone do it on top of an already littered ground, they were much more likely. But we also can use social norms to intentionally to help people behave more optimally. So a software company in the US called O-Power decided to see what they could do to help people conserve energy in the household. And they used what's called home energy reports, which are regular reports mailed to customers, and they compared each household's energy use to other households, other neighbors. And they found that simply sending consumers a letter comparing their energy use to their neighbors reduced the average energy consumption by 2.7%. And this is equivalent to what you might expect if you increase the energy cost by 20%. So simply just by mailing this letter and telling people how they were doing relative to their neighbors, they didn't have to increase costs, but they were able to help households conserve their energy. And if this program was scaled up nationwide, they estimated that the net value of the intervention would be the equivalent of $2.2 billion. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about how the choices we see, both what we see and how we see the choices and how they're presented influences our decisions. A classic example of how our choice set can influence our behavior comes from a study conducted in a supermarket. So consumers walked by a tasting table, which had either a limited selection of jam, where there were 6 different flavors, or an extensive selection of jam, where there were 24 different flavors. And shoppers who approached the table were allowed to taste as many as they wanted, and were given $1 coupon to purchase the jam. Can anyone guess, and you can put it in the chat or just say it in your own mind, which configuration people were more likely to stop at? I see 6. I see a lot of 6s. All right. Actually, people were more likely to stop at the one with more choices. So 60% of shoppers who passed the extensive selection table stopped at it. However, only 40% of the shoppers who passed the limited selection stopped at it. And there was no difference in the proportion of people who tasted the jam. But I think everyone may have jumped the gun because, in fact, when we look at actual purchases, the fewer choices was the one that won out. So while those who passed the larger display were more likely to stop, they were less likely to actually make a purchase. Only about 3% of the shoppers who passed the extensive display actually purchased any jam. In comparison, those who passed the one with only 6 choices were more likely to buy the jam in the end, and about 30% of them actually wound up doing so. And this is kind of referred to as like the jam study, but the authors have actually tested this phenomenon in other contexts, and they found variation in how large the effect is, but the overall trend still holds, that there's kind of something called choice conflict, where people can be paralyzed by having too much decision, even though we may intuitively want more choice. So finally, for the third contextual feature we'll talk about today is chronic scarcity. So when we talk about scarcity, we often talk about money, but many different resources can be scarce, including money, calories, and time, and even our cognitive bandwidth. And in fact, the previous three can all contribute to having scarce cognitive bandwidth. And studies have shown that when people are operating in a context of scarcity and have limited cognitive bandwidth, they are more prone to make mistakes, get distracted, focus on the present, act automatically, and neglect others' perspectives. So they're more susceptible to kind of the quirks of our brain, not because of something inherent in that person, but because of the situation they find themselves in. So in behavioral science, we think of scarcity, whether that's financial strain or being time limited, as a mental bandwidth tax that weighs on your mind and prevents people from performing at their full capacity. And you can think about this intuitively, perhaps. Think about the last time maybe you were overwhelmed or under rested or had too many things going on, and how that impaired maybe your decision making and thinking. And there's evidence that scarcity does tax cognitive bandwidth from various field experiments. And one of these studies was done with sugarcane farmers in India. So this study was based on the fact that the harvest season for sugarcane and farmers' income is cyclical. So right after a harvest, the farmers have a lot of money, which they can then spend over the next few months as they wait for their new batch of sugarcane to grow. So right before the next harvest is when they have the least amount of money. And researchers found that during this pre-harvest period of financial scarcity, farmers were more likely to have loans, pawned items at a higher rate, and were more likely to report having difficulty coping with ordinary bills compared to the post-harvest period. So researchers gave farmers a cognitive performance test, both before harvest and after harvest. And they found a significantly greater number of errors and more trade-off thinking pre-harvest compared to post-harvest. So this shows that during the pre-harvest period of scarcity, when farmers were facing financial strain and operating in scarcity, that actually impacted their ability to perform cognitively compared to after the harvest when they had some more slack and were no longer in that context of scarcity. So to interpret this finding, we think the farmers' pre-harvest kind of concerns and thinking that they had to do used up finite mental resources, leaving less of those resources for other tasks. And when we talk about scarcity, I think one kind of metaphor that I find useful is to kind of imagine you're packing for a trip. And maybe this is post-COVID, in the future when we're able to travel again. And if you have to pack in only a small carry-on, you're going to have to make some difficult decisions, perhaps whether to bring a suit, whether to bring the extra pair of shoes, which of your favorite sweaters to bring, whether you need that heavy jacket. In comparison, if you have a large suitcase that you can check in, you simply don't have to spend as much cognitive energy and make as many of those trade-offs or decisions. It's a much easier task. So that's kind of one way we can think about scarcity. So a quick summary of what we've discussed so far. Behavioral science studies human behavior and how humans actually make decisions in the real world, and how that might contrast at sometimes with what we traditionally assume. The context, or the world around us and elements of our surroundings, including what other people are doing, how many choices are presented to us, or kind of whether we're operating in a state of scarcity. All these things matter a lot. And while standard decision making assume that people weigh their costs and benefits and make the right choices, and follow on those intentions, actual behavioral models show that people are likely to behave differently depending on the context. So next, we'll launch into 2 case studies to show how Ideas42 has applied our behavioral approach in practice. But before we move on, I wanted to pause and see if there were any questions at this point. Let me look in the chat. And feel free to unmute and ask any clarifying questions about what we've discussed so far, or ask in the chat. I'll give it maybe 1 more minute.
Cecilia, I can read a question from the chat that's related to scarcity that maybe you can talk about quickly.
Sure.
So user ING481, I'm not sure who you are exactly, but they say, when in a context of scarcity, our minds are focused on making decisions that are optimal for present or the short term, but can be detrimental to our future. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what present bias is and how that might come into play?
Yeah, thanks, Abby, for elevating that. User ING481, that is a very, very astute observation, and actually one of the major psychological concepts that we use a lot in behavioral science is what Abby just mentioned, present bias. So people are much more likely to overweigh what is kind of immediately in front of us and what we have in the short term, and undervalue potential benefits and consequences in the future. And this is something that happens for all of us and in a number of contexts, whether that's in purchasing behavior or kind of in those exercise examples about kind of short-term versus long-term benefits. But I think it shows up in a number of ways, and it's especially exacerbated by scarcity, and makes it even more intense. I'm not sure, in response to the question, whether there's any findings applying to Indigenous or Afro communities.
I can actually have a crack at. Yeah, so we haven't done any research on that. Well, we've done a lot of applied research. So I think a lot of our work speaks to specific contexts and interventions, which when we find that our interventions work, it sort of validates our assumptions about the behavior. But that's not as much academic research. That's much more applied research that we're doing. But our colleagues at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics based in Nairobi, their main mission is to sort of take these research studies, which have been validated in a Western context, and test them out in non-Western contexts. So I think if you're interested in some academic research on how things apply in Indigenous or Afrocentric communities, would definitely look into them. And if you're interested in learning about how applied research and that, you can definitely check out our website.
Thanks, Abby. I see a question. What are some ways to reduce scarcity when making decisions. And yeah, scarcity bias is a perfectly okay term. So that's a really great question. I think there are a number of ways you can approach it. So I think it's also worth making the point that the impact of scarcity occurs whether that scarcity is, it's about the perception of scarcity. So people, even if they might have enough time, for example, if they feel that they are scarce in time, it can lead to kind of the more detrimental impacts we talked about. So one way you can change scarcity, perhaps the most obvious, is to simply kind of give people more resources. So whether that be giving people more monetary resources or more time, or just reducing the number of things that are pulling on their attention and distracting them. So the first thing you can do, I guess, is to just make it so that they aren't operating in a context of scarcity. You can also, I think, reframe how people are perceiving. So if they feel time limited, is that a product of how they are kind of thinking about their time and how they're splitting it up? Can you help them think about it differently so that they perceive and experience their situation a little bit differently? Abby, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No, that was great. Thanks.
Well, oh, I see more questions. Maybe, let me just check time. Maybe we can answer 2 more. Development professionals and project managers often say that changing behavior will take years and will be extremely expensive. What will be your answer to that? Great. So I do want to caveat and say, like, behavioral science has been shown to be effective, and we think is a low cost and very helpful way to think about behavior change. But by no means do we think that this is the one shot be all solution to change behavior. And just to be very candid, the studies that we cite and that we talk about, the percentage change is often around 5%, right? So we're not thinking that we're going to change everyone's behavior and do so very quickly. I think behavioral science is helpful in thinking about, in addition to perhaps other things that might be expensive and take years, kind of opening the toolbox in terms of the solution set and thinking about more of the oftentimes low cost solutions that can have a pretty measurable and significant impact given kind of the cost it takes to implement.
And I'll just add on to that as well, Cecilia, because I think, Anton, to answer your question, that's pushback that we get often as well, that, you know, changing behavior will take years and be expensive. And I do think when development professionals, particularly in the health space, think about changing behavior, they're often thinking about changing social norms or social and behavior change communication. And changing social norms does take a long time, and often isn't that effective, and the interventions are very intensive. But I think they're less likely to be thinking about the small c context, like all of these little contextual features or small cues in our environment. And I think that's where we come in, and where we're kind of different than a lot of organizations working in the behavior change space, is we're trying to take advantage of all of the different contextual features, not just focusing so much on social norms, which I think is the default in people's minds often.
Great. Thanks, Abby. I know that there are more questions, but for the sake of time, to make sure we get through everything, maybe I'll move on for now. And then if we have time at the end, we can come back to them. And Abby can also coordinate in the chat. Great. So for our first case study, we're going to talk about an intervention that Ideas42 did in Costa Rica to help conserve water. So in 2014, Ideas42 partnered with the World Bank and the municipality of Belen in Costa Rica on a project to reduce household water consumption. And despite the fact that Costa Rica is classified as a water-rich nation, the city of Belen was using 25% more water than the national average. And there was a considerable risk at the time of water deficit in the future. So reducing water consumption was a policy priority. Now, resource conservation and especially water conservation is not a new issue, and many approaches have certainly been applied. One traditional approach has been to increase the price of water in an effort to impact demand, and another has been to simply restrict the supply. But as we all know, and I know some of you are city officials and kind of work in this space, raising water prices or restricting supply is quite challenging, both politically and also emotionally. And the consequences may disproportionately affect low-income households. So for this project, we spent some time trying to unpack the reasons why people were consuming so much water. And we uncovered several interesting insights. So first, while there was broad consensus about the importance of water conservation in general, and how maybe others needed to change behavior, few residents believed that they themselves needed to use less water. So in other words, people didn't really think of themselves as the problem. Secondly, residents lacked a benchmark against which to compare how to compare their own consumption. So they were unable to estimate how much water they use individually, and then to know whether that level of consumption was acceptable or unacceptable. And finally, even with the best of intentions, despite perhaps being interested in saving water, few residents could actually identify concrete steps that they could take to help them reduce their water consumption. So building off of these insights, we decided to leverage the water bill itself as a channel for intentional behavioral design. And this is a tactic that's similar to the energy consumption example we discussed earlier. And we built off of kind of the previous studies that have been done and tailored it for the Costa Rican context. So because we wanted to make our intervention low tech and very simple, we settled on two solutions: stickers and postcards. So the stickers on the left in blue and yellow could be placed on any utility bill without requiring personalization. And they compared a household's water use to that of its neighbors. And for those who used more water than their neighbors, they received the bottom sticker, which included actionable steps to take that they could take to reduce water consumption. And stickers also had a frowny or smiley face to make it kind of emotionally salient how a household was doing on their water usage in a way that was more relevant to them than perhaps just telling them in numbers how much water they used. In addition to the stickers, we also created and sent a postcard to address the fact that people didn't have a clear plan for saving water or even information on how to do so. So the postcards encouraged households to set goals and plan specific water saving activities. And this simple act of plan making and goal setting and writing it down has been shown to really significantly help people follow through on their intentions in a lot of different domains, including vaccination and voting. So as a result, these stickers and postcards, by providing residents with feedback about their water use and giving them kind of concrete actions they could take, it reduced their monthly water usage by 5%. And at scale, if implemented throughout the entire city, this would translate to 6,720 cubic meters of water saved in Belen. So our second case study was in partnership with the New York Housing Authority. And in this project, we focused on waste management issues. And I think some of the multi-city challenge participants are working on waste management, so this one might be of interest. So the New York City Housing Authority, otherwise known as NYCHA, is the largest public housing authority in North America and was created to help New Yorkers have decent and affordable housing, especially for low and moderate income New Yorkers. So together with NYCHA, the goal was to improve the quality of life in the developments by addressing 3 waste issues, and that was household trash, dog waste, and litter. And when we tried to examine this problem from a behavioral perspective, we found a couple interesting things about the context that contributed. So for household trash and for litter, we found, for example, that residents take cues from what they're seeing other people are doing and place trash in front of the building. And in fact, the "don't put garbage here" signs actually backfired and just became salient spots as signposts for where people were putting their garbage. And we also found that dropping off your trash was inconvenient. It required a long walk, which was enough of a hassle to deter many of the residents. And for dog waste, we found that residents would sometimes simply forget to bring or buy bags for picking up in advance. And while they might have started to see fines as being kind of empty threats, the very framing around the fines being punishment may have undermined any previously intrinsic motivation they had to be a good neighbor. So instead of saying, "I'm going to do this because I'm going to be a good person and be a good neighbor," they may have started to see the action more as transactional. So our theory of change, or the solutions that the team who worked on this project decided on, was a combination of providing both resources, convenient infrastructure, as well as information through behavioral communication. So the tilt trucks and trash cans gave residents a convenient place to deposit their household trash, and they placed these in spots that were easy access to give also people a place to deposit their dog waste. And to help form a habit and use these resources, the team put up a poster campaign that utilized supportive, community-oriented messaging that looked visually different than other posters at the site, so that they would stand out, and kind of reframed it around the collective good rather than the fines or the consequences or the punishments. And together, this solutions package had a significant impact on improving all 3 waste behaviors. So reduced the bags of household trash by 25%, reduced litter by 16%, and reduced the amount of dog waste left out by 11%. So those are our 2 case studies, and now comes the more fun portion of the last little bit of this presentation, where you don't have to hear someone talk at you, and you can actually share your own thoughts and ideas. So Erna will help break us into some breakout rooms. And in these breakout rooms, we ask that you kind of reflect a little bit about the contextual features we've shared and some of the concepts that we talked about today, about social norms, choice set, scarcity, or perhaps anything else that's come up on your mind. And think about whether you've encountered it recently in your work, in your everyday life, or perhaps with respect to the challenges, the urban challenges you're working on. And think maybe about what kind of behaviors, whether desirable or undesirable, it led to. And then in the breakout rooms, you can share these examples with your group.
Yep. So you will be assigned to 7 breakout rooms with 8 to 10 people. So I'm gonna assign automatically now.
Lorna, will you let me know when everyone comes back? Or
21 seconds until we're back.
Hi guys, good morning. I think I'm not sure what's going on. I got bounced and now I'm back. I think I'm in the breakout session. Can someone just guide me quickly what it is that I have to do, please? Sorry, I'm Alextina from Guyana.
Hi, sorry, we just had that breakout discussion just now, and we are all now back to the main session. So I think we're done with the discussion in the smaller groups. So we will continue with our main presentation now.
Okay then. Thank you so much for responding.
No worries.
And I know we're at the hour, so if people do need to drop off, very, very understandable, and we'll not take any offense. And sorry, we had shorter breakout rooms than I'm sure people could have talked for longer. And hopefully these conversations can continue after. If anyone has anything particularly interesting that they heard or we're starting to talk about, feel free to share it in the chat for everyone else. But just wanted to say, kind of to close off, thank you so much for your time and for listening in this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you may be in the world. And we kind of, in this hour, just covered a little bit, provided a taste. I'm sure we might have raised more questions as well. So if you're interested or just wondering how you can learn more or how your city or your team could start using behavioral science, there are a number of ways in which you could get started. We have resources to build internal capacity. Ideas42 does run masterclass such as this, but we also have on our website many different reports and blogs. You can go to behub.org to find more studies and information. Or you might want to start by employing or embedding a team of researchers who already have the expertise. And we're always happy to talk about that. And we also kind of even have, for certain types of interventions, we're trying to offer solutions that would bear little or no kind of monetary risk to a city. And if you're interested in learning more about any of this, Abby and myself and our other colleague, Lara, who wasn't able to make it, would be happy to be in touch and answer any questions. And we can share our contact information as well.
Thank you, Cecilia, for a fantastic presentation today. And you were on time. We had 1 hour session scheduled for all of us, and we had a very good attendance. Thank you, Abby, as well, facilitating the chat box and question and answer session. It has been really interesting. And I hope most of us, UNDP colleagues, as well as the city colleagues, have learned something from both of you, how norms can motivate our behavior and how it can be leveraged for good or better efficiency, optimizing our efficiency, and how simple things could influence human behavior. We talked a lot. We had a very engaging discussion in the chat box as well as in the breakout room. So thanks again for all your participation and sticking to until the end of this session. We organize public events, one on Smart Cities training series, and we will continue to get in touch with our Multi-City Challenge colleagues from the cities, as well as the UNDP country offices. So stay tuned for upcoming webinars and masterclasses. And thanks again for the fantastic presentation by Ideas42. And as Abby has written in the chat box, you may reach out to Cecilia and Abby through their email addresses. So thanks very much for connecting today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Much appreciation from you. It was very interesting and nice sharing ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gabby. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Really very interesting. Thank you very much. Love to learn more. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get in touch with the slides and the presentation and further resources. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day or evening. Bye.
Gracias, Cecilia. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hi. Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a really nice discussion. We benefited a lot. Hope we'll have enough time next time.
Okay, thanks. Bye, everyone. Ending the meeting now.